The dreams only stopped frightening me the day she finally spoke. I woke before sunrise with my heart racing, staring at the ceiling of my Boston apartment while the last echoes of the dream refused to disappear. For more than 15 years, I had seen the same woman standing beside the same quiet lake wrapped in silver morning mist. She never walked closer. She never reached toward me. She simply waited beneath the branches of an enormous willow tree while gentle ripples spread across perfectly still water. Every dream ended the same way. I woke before learning who she was. Until last night. This time she finally looked directly into my eyes. Her expression carried neither sadness nor fear. It carried certainty. The morning light behind her painted the lake in pale shades of gold, while the wind lifted a few loose strands of her auburn hair. She smiled as though she had been waiting through countless seasons for a single moment. Then she quietly whispered 6 words that continued echoing inside my mind long after I opened my eyes. "It is finally time for you." I sat upright, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself it had only been another dream. Yet something felt different. The words refused to fade the way dreams usually do. They remained sharp and clear, almost like a memory instead of imagination. I walked into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee before checking my phone. At exactly 6:15 that morning, a message waited from the attorney handling my late mother's estate. The subject line read, "Final property documents." I stared at the screen without opening the email. My mother had passed away nearly 3 months earlier, and despite handling every legal responsibility, I still had not returned to Maple Ridge, the small Vermont town where I had grown up. Every excuse sounded reasonable. Work had become overwhelming. My architectural projects required constant attention. Winter weather had complicated travel. But deep inside, I knew none of those explanations were the real reason. Returning home meant opening doors I had carefully kept closed for years. It meant walking through rooms filled with memories that had never completely left me. It also meant facing questions I had avoided asking myself since childhood, especially the strange dreams that always seemed connected to that place. As I finally opened the attorney's email, one sentence immediately caught my attention. Before her passing, your mother requested that a locked cedar box inside the attic not be opened until you returned personally. I read the sentence 3 more times. My mother had always loved leaving handwritten notes, carefully labeled envelopes, and little surprises hidden throughout the house, but this felt different. Why insist that I return in person? Why wait until now? I finished my coffee, looked once more through the apartment window at the busy Boston streets below, and made a decision that felt strangely inevitable. 2 days later, my car crossed the Vermont state line beneath a sky filled with low gray clouds. Familiar forests stretched for miles beside the highway, while old wooden barns appeared exactly where I remembered them. Every mile seemed to awaken fragments of memories I could almost recognize without fully understanding. By late afternoon, the road curved toward Maple Ridge. The church steeple rose above the treetops. The small bookstore still occupied the corner across from the town square. The lake shimmered quietly beyond the hills. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I had never consciously remembered that lake before, yet I recognized it instantly. It was the same lake from every dream. As I slowly drove into town, an unexpected feeling settled over me. It did not feel like I was returning somewhere familiar. It felt as though someone had been patiently waiting for me to arrive. The familiar streets of Maple Ridge looked almost untouched by time as I drove slowly toward my mother's house. White fences still bordered quiet front yards, old maple trees stretched across narrow sidewalks, and neighbors greeted one another exactly as they had when I was a child. Yet beneath that comforting familiarity, I felt something impossible to explain. Every corner seemed to awaken fragments of memories that disappeared before I could fully recognize them. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the old cedar house stood waiting beneath towering pine trees, its wide front porch glowing softly beneath the late afternoon sun. My mother had always believed houses carried memories the same way people carried stories. Standing there, I suddenly understood what she meant. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The scent of cedar, lavender, and old books still lingered in the air as though she had only stepped outside for a moment. Nothing had changed. Her favorite rocking chair remained beside the fireplace. Family photographs lined the hallway. A knitted blanket still rested neatly across the living room sofa. For several minutes, I simply stood there, unable to move. Grief arrived quietly instead of all at once, mixing with gratitude for every ordinary moment this house had once held. Eventually, I remembered the attorney's message. The locked cedar box waited somewhere in the attic. I climbed the narrow staircase slowly, each wooden step producing the familiar creak I remembered from childhood. Sunlight filtered through the small attic window, illuminating shelves filled with carefully labeled storage boxes, old holiday decorations, and stacks of family albums. Near the far wall stood an antique cedar chest. Resting neatly on top was a smaller cedar box secured with an old brass lock. Beside it lay a cream-colored envelope with my name written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Emma, if you are reading this, then you came home because your heart was finally ready, not because life forced you to return. Please do not open the box until you first visit the lake before sunrise. Someone has been waiting there much longer than you realize. I read the letter again, certain I had misunderstood. Visit the lake before sunrise. Someone has been waiting there. The words echoed strangely against the dream I had experienced only days earlier. I looked toward the locked cedar box, tempted to ignore my mother's instructions, but experience had taught me she always had a reason for everything she asked. As evening settled over Maple Ridge, I unpacked only the essentials before walking onto the back porch. The quiet countryside stretched peacefully toward distant hills while the first stars appeared above the trees. My eyes drifted almost instinctively toward the lake visible through the forest beyond the property. Even from this distance, I recognized the outline of the enormous willow tree standing along the shoreline. My breathing slowed. It was exactly the same tree from every dream. I slept lightly that night, waking several times before dawn. Long before sunrise, I pulled on my coat, grabbed a flashlight, and followed the narrow woodland path leading toward the water. Morning mist drifted silently between the trees while birds had not yet begun their songs. As I stepped onto the lakeshore, everything became eerily familiar. The willow tree stood exactly where I expected. Gentle ripples crossed the perfectly still water. Pale blue light spread across the horizon. Then I stopped walking altogether. A woman stood beneath the willow tree facing the lake, her auburn hair moving gently in the morning breeze. She had not turned toward me yet, but I recognized her instantly. She was the woman who had lived inside my dreams for 15 years. For several long seconds, I could not breathe. The woman remained standing beneath the willow tree with her back turned toward me while morning mist drifted quietly across the lake exactly as it had in every dream. The scene was so familiar that I almost expected to wake up in my apartment again. Instead, I felt the damp grass beneath my boots and the cold Vermont air against my face. This was real. I took one cautious step forward. The sound of a twig breaking beneath my foot echoed softly through the silent shoreline. Slowly, the woman turned around. The moment our eyes met, an overwhelming sense of recognition rushed through me. Her green eyes, her gentle expression, the way the morning breeze lifted strands of her auburn hair, every detail matched the dreams that had followed me for 15 years. Yet seeing her in daylight somehow felt even more impossible. She looked at me with quiet surprise before offering the smallest smile. "You came," she said softly. Her voice was exactly the one I had heard only once before, the voice that had whispered inside my dream only days earlier. I stared at her, unable to form a complete sentence. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask. The woman hesitated before answering. "My name is Claire Sullivan." She watched my expression carefully, almost as though expecting her name to awaken something inside me. It did not, at least not completely. Instead, I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, as if forgotten memories were pressing gently against a locked door somewhere inside my mind. Claire looked toward the quiet lake before speaking again. "Your mother told me this day would eventually come." My heart skipped. "You knew my mother?" She nodded. "For many years." I searched her face for any clue that might explain why she had lived inside my dreams for so long. "Why have I never met you?" The question lingered between us, while gentle waves rolled onto the shoreline. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering carefully. Maybe you did. A chill ran through me despite the growing warmth of the sunrise. I studied her face again, searching for something familiar beyond the dreams themselves. There was kindness in her expression, but also quiet sadness, as though she had been carrying an invisible weight for a very long time. I do not remember, I admitted. Claire smiled gently. I know. She reached into the pocket of her wool coat and carefully removed an old photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. Without saying another word, she handed it to me. My hands trembled as I looked down. The photograph had clearly been taken many years earlier beside this very lake. My mother stood smiling near the willow tree with one arm around a young girl whose auburn hair and green eyes were unmistakable even as a child. Standing beside them was another little girl wearing a blue sweater. I stared at the second child for several seconds before my heartbeat suddenly quickened. It was me. I looked back at Claire in disbelief. This cannot be real. She nodded quietly. It is. My eyes moved repeatedly between the photograph and the woman standing before me. We had once stood together at this lake as children, yet I could not remember a single moment of it. Why do I not? Remember you? I whispered. Claire looked toward the water, where the first sunlight shimmered across the lake surface. That, she answered softly, is the same question I have been hoping you would ask for the last 17 years. At that exact moment, a sudden flash of memory crossed my mind. I saw two young girls laughing beneath the willow tree, heard someone calling my name across the water, and felt a small hand slipping gently into mine before the vision disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only one overwhelming certainty. Somehow the woman standing before me had always been part of my life, even though my memories had forgotten her. The photograph remained in my hands as the morning mist slowly lifted from the lake. I could not stop staring at the two smiling children standing beneath the willow tree. Every instinct told me the memory should have been familiar, yet my mind remained frustratingly empty. Claire watched me with remarkable patience, allowing the silence to settle naturally between us. Finally, I looked up. If we knew each other this well, why can I only remember dreams? Claire lowered her eyes before answering. Because the last day we spent together changed everything. The quiet certainty in her voice sent another wave of questions through my mind. What happened? She hesitated, as though carefully choosing every word. Your mother believed you deserved to remember it in the right order. I frowned slightly. She planned all of this. Claire nodded. More carefully than you probably realize. She slowly reached into her coat pocket once more and removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She asked me to keep this until you recognize the lake for yourself. I immediately recognized the ribbon. My mother used the same pale blue ribbon on every important keepsake she wanted me to treasure. Claire gently placed the key into my palm. It belongs to the cedar box in your attic. I looked down at the key before glancing back toward the quiet shoreline. Why could she not simply tell me everything? Claire smiled sadly. Because memories given too early are only stories. Memories discovered at the right moment become part of who you are. Her answer sounded exactly like something my mother would have said. We began walking slowly along the edge of the lake while the first sunlight filtered through the willow branches. Every few steps another faint image flickered through my mind. Two young girls skipping stones across the water. A picnic blanket covered with books. My mother's laughter drifting across the shore. None of the memories lasted more than a second before disappearing again. You always loved this place, Claire said quietly. You believed every sunrise looked different. I stopped walking. How do you remember all of this so clearly? She looked across the water with a thoughtful expression. Because I never forgot. There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet honesty. We reached an old wooden bench overlooking the lake. The weathered wood carried dozens of carved initials left by couples and families over many years. Claire gently brushed away a thin layer of fallen leaves from one corner of the bench. Hidden beneath them were two small initials carved side by side many years ago. EC and CS. My heart began beating faster. We carved this, I whispered. Claire nodded with a faint smile. The summer before everything changed. I slowly traced the faded letters with my fingertips. Another brief memory flashed through my mind. I saw my younger self laughing while carefully carving the first letter. Claire pretended to criticize my crooked handwriting before carving her own beside it. Then both girls promised they would always return to the lake every first sunrise of autumn. The memory vanished almost instantly, but this time it left behind an unexpected feeling instead of confusion. It felt like longing. I turned toward Claire. You kept the promise, did not you? She smiled gently. Every single year. I looked out across the calm water, where sunlight now danced across gentle ripples. For 15 years, someone had quietly returned to this place, waiting for memories that only one of us still carried. As that realization settled inside me, I slipped the brass key safely into my coat pocket. For the first time since coming home, I no longer felt like I was searching for answers. I felt as though the answers had been patiently waiting for me all along, hidden inside a locked cedar box, an old photograph, and the woman who had never truly disappeared from my life, only from my memory. The brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in my coat pocket as Claire and I walked back toward town beneath the sky slowly brightening with the arrival of morning. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. It no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the quiet understanding that some conversations required patience before they could truly begin. When we reached the edge of Maple Ridge, Claire stopped beside the old bookstore standing across from the town square. The familiar brick building looked lovingly maintained, its large front windows displaying rows of books surrounded by fresh flowers. She smiled gently. I open in about an hour. I glanced toward the neatly painted sign above the entrance. You own the bookstore? She nodded. Your mother convinced me to buy it 12 years ago. She said every small town deserves a place where stories can safely wait for people who need them. I smiled despite everything. That sounds exactly like her. Claire unlocked the front door and invited me inside. Warm light filled the cozy interior while shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with novels, journals, travel books, and local history. The scent of cedar and freshly brewed coffee immediately reminded me of childhood afternoons spent reading beside my mother. As I wandered slowly through the aisles, my eyes paused on a framed photograph resting behind the front counter. It showed my mother smiling beside Claire during the bookstore's grand reopening years earlier. They looked genuinely happy. You stayed close to her, I said quietly. Claire nodded. She became the family I still had. Before I could ask another question, she opened a small wooden drawer beneath the register and carefully removed a bundle of envelopes tied together with pale blue ribbon. Every envelope carried my name written in elegant handwriting. My heartbeat quickened. These were never mailed, Claire said softly. I wrote one every year after you left Maple Ridge. I looked at her in disbelief. You wrote to me? She lowered her eyes. I never believed I had the right to interrupt the life you were building, but writing helped me believe that somewhere, somehow, you were still part of my story. My hands trembled as I accepted the bundle. The oldest envelope was dated only weeks after my family moved away. The newest had been written less than a month before my mother's passing. 17 years of letters rested between my fingers. Why did you keep them? I asked. Claire looked toward the bookstore window where morning sunlight now reached the quiet street outside. Because your mother asked me to wait until your own memories began leading you back instead of my words. The answer settled quietly inside me. Every step of this journey had been carefully arranged, not to control my choices, but to allow me to discover the truth at my own pace. I carefully slipped the letters into my shoulder bag before leaving the bookstore. Claire walked with me as far as my mother's house before stopping at the front gate. The key belongs to the cedar box, she reminded me gently. Everything else begins there. I nodded before stepping inside the familiar house. Sunlight streamed through the hallway windows exactly as it had countless mornings before. I climbed the attic stairs once again and placed the small brass key into the waiting lock. For a brief moment I hesitated, remembering every strange dream, every forgotten memory, every impossible coincidence that had brought me home. Then I slowly turned the key. The lock clicked open with surprising ease. As I lifted the lid, I did not find jewelry or family documents waiting inside. Instead, the cedar box contained dozens of neatly arranged cassette tapes, several leather-bound journals, and one sealed envelope bearing only a single handwritten sentence from my mother. Before you read another word, you must remember the summer neither of you were ever supposed to forget. The sealed envelope rested quietly on top of the journals as afternoon sunlight filtered through the small attic window, filling the cedar box with warm golden light. I stared at my mother's handwriting for several long moments before carefully breaking the seal. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age, yet every word remained perfectly clear. Emma, if you have reached this point, then you have already found Claire, returned to the lake, and remembered enough to continue. What you are searching for is not hidden inside these journals. It is hidden inside yourself. The journals will only help you unlock the memories that have been patiently waiting. I slowly lowered the letter and reached for the first leather-bound journal. A pressed willow leaf rested between the opening pages. Beneath it, my mother had written a single date. August, 17 years ago. I began reading. Today, Emma and Claire spent the entire afternoon by the lake. They promised they would return together every first sunrise of autumn because they believe some places should always remember the people who love them. Neither of them realizes how quickly life can change. My chest tightened as another brief image flashed through my mind. Two teenage girls sat on the old wooden dock with their shoes resting beside them. One of them laughed while tossing tiny pebbles across the calm water. The other carefully sketched the willow tree inside a notebook. The memory disappeared almost instantly, but this time I recognized both faces, without hesitation. They were Claire and me. I turned another page. Over the following entries, my mother described countless ordinary days. She wrote about library visits, bicycle rides through maple forests, afternoons spent reading beside the lake, and evenings when Claire stayed for dinner because both families treated one another like lifelong friends. Every page painted the picture of two young women whose friendship had quietly become the center of their world. Yet I still could not understand why every memory had vanished. Near the middle of the journal, I discovered another folded note tucked carefully between the pages. It contained only one sentence. Listen to the first cassette before reading any further. I immediately reached into the cedar box and removed the oldest cassette tape. The attic still held my mother's small cassette recorder, exactly where she had always kept it. After replacing the batteries from a nearby drawer, I carefully pressed the play button. Static filled the room for several seconds before my mother's familiar voice emerged with remarkable clarity. Emma, today I am recording something I hope you never need to hear. If you are listening, then life unfolded differently than any of us wished. I closed my eyes as her gentle voice continued. There are moments when the human mind protects itself by placing unbearable memories behind closed doors. It does not erase love. It only hides the path leading back to it until the heart becomes strong enough to walk there again. Tears gathered quietly as I listened. She spoke about kindness, patience, and the importance of allowing memories to return naturally instead of forcing them. Then her tone softened even more. Claire wanted to tell you the truth before your family left Maple Ridge. I asked her not to. Not because her feelings were wrong, but because both of you deserve the chance to grow without carrying questions neither of you were old enough to answer. The recording stopped abruptly, with the quiet click of the cassette reaching its end. I remained completely still. My mother had known everything long before either of us fully understood it ourselves. A sudden knock echoed softly from downstairs. Startled, I quickly gathered the journal and cassette before walking toward the front door. When I opened it, Claire stood on the porch holding a small weathered notebook tied with the same pale blue ribbon that seemed to connect every piece of my mother's carefully planned journey. She looked at me with gentle uncertainty before quietly saying, "I think you are finally ready to see what we wrote together during the last summer we still remembered every single day." Claire stepped quietly into the living room carrying the weathered notebook with both hands as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the maple trees surrounding my mother's house, while the quiet streets of Maple Ridge settled into another peaceful evening. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt respectful, almost sacred, because we both understood that every answer waiting inside the notebook had survived 17 years without being forgotten. Claire carefully placed it on the coffee table between us. The faded blue ribbon wrapped around its worn leather cover matched the ribbon tied around the unopened letters, the cedar box key, and every keepsake my mother had protected so carefully. "We bought this together at the bookstore," Claire said softly. "Your idea was that every summer deserved its own story." I reached toward the notebook with unexpected hesitation. My fingers brushed the cover, and another brief memory flickered across my mind. Two teenage girls stood laughing inside the bookstore while arguing over which notebook looked more adventurous. One chose dark blue leather. The other insisted this weathered brown journal looked as though it already carried memories before anyone wrote inside it. I smiled without realizing it. I remembered choosing this one. Claire looked at me with quiet surprise. "You do?" I nodded slowly. "Only little pieces, but they feel real now." I untied the ribbon and opened the first page. Across the top we had written together in uneven handwriting, "Summer of Promises." Beneath the title another sentence appeared in blue ink. "If one of us ever forgets, the other will remember for both of us." My breathing slowed. I turned another page. The notebook contained ordinary moments more than dramatic ones. We described early morning walks beside the lake, afternoons reading beneath the willow tree, homemade lemonade on the front porch, bicycle rides through quiet country roads, and dreams about traveling across America after college. Every page revealed two young women who believed the future would always include one another. The simplicity of those memories somehow made them even more emotional. Halfway through the notebook, I found a page where my own handwriting suddenly stopped. The remaining paragraphs belonged entirely to Claire. I looked up. She quietly lowered her eyes. "That was after your family decided to leave." I returned to the page. Claire had written about spending every afternoon by the lake alone because she hoped one more shared memory might somehow become strong enough to survive distance. She admitted she never found the courage to tell me how deeply I mattered because she feared placing expectations on a future neither of us could control. My eyes filled with tears as another memory surfaced unexpectedly. I remembered standing beside a moving truck outside my childhood home while neighbors gathered to say goodbye. Claire stood several yards away holding a small wrapped package. Before she reached me, another adult gently called her back to help load boxes into a nearby car. We smiled at each other one final time. Then everything became strangely blurred. I closed the notebook and pressed my fingertips gently against my forehead. "I remember leaving," I whispered. "But after that, everything disappears." Claire moved no closer, giving me space exactly as she always seemed to know I needed. "Your mother believed the shock of losing so much at once caused your mind to protect itself," she said quietly. "She hoped the memories would eventually return when you were ready instead of when you were hurting." I looked toward the living room window where evening sunlight reflected softly across the distant lake. "You waited 17 years because you believed she was right." Claire smiled with quiet honesty. "I waited because every dream worth keeping deserves patience." At that exact moment, another vivid memory returned with remarkable clarity. I saw the wrapped package Claire had tried to give me on the day I left Maple Ridge. It had been tied with pale blue ribbon, and inside, I suddenly remembered there had been only one simple gift. It was this very notebook, the one now resting open between us, somehow finding its way home before either of us fully remembered why it had always belonged to both of us. The notebook remained open on the coffee table long after the evening sun disappeared behind the pine trees surrounding my mother's house. Neither Claire nor I reached to close it. Every page seemed to breathe with pieces of a life that had quietly waited for me to remember. Outside, the first stars appeared above Maple Ridge, while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of the lake through the open windows. I looked once more at the sentence we had written together years earlier. "If one of us ever forgets, the other will remember for both of us." The words no longer felt like something two teenagers had written on a summer afternoon. They felt like a promise that had survived 17 years without either of us fully understanding how much it would one day matter. Claire stood and walked toward the bookshelf where my mother had always kept family albums. She carefully removed one worn blue album before returning to the sofa. "There is something else I think you should see," she said softly. She opened the album to a page filled with photographs from our final summer together. At first I saw only ordinary moments. We were feeding ducks beside the lake, planting flowers outside the bookstore, riding bicycles through quiet country roads, and laughing on the front porch beneath strings of summer lights. Then my attention settled on one photograph taken beneath the willow tree. Claire and I sat shoulder to shoulder, holding the very notebook now resting between us. Behind us, my mother stood smiling while taking the picture through a mirror placed against the tree. Without warning, another memory returned with remarkable clarity. I remembered that afternoon completely. We had spent hours talking about our future while watching sunlight dance across the lake. Claire had admitted she wanted to remain in Maple Ridge forever because every place she loved was already there. I had laughed and told her I wanted to become an architect before someday returning home. My mother had quietly listened from a nearby picnic blanket without interrupting either of us. The memory continued instead of fading away. I remembered Claire giving me the notebook wrapped in pale blue ribbon before asking me to write one promise inside. I had written that no matter where life carried us, we would always meet at the lake on the first sunrise of autumn. Claire wrote beneath my words that if distance ever separated us, dreams would help us remember the way back. My eyes widened. I slowly looked toward Claire.
"The
dreams." She nodded before I finished speaking. They were never predictions. I felt another memory unlock itself. The dreams had always repeated the lake exactly as it had looked on our last morning together because my mind had preserved one place that still connected every forgotten memory. The woman standing beneath the willow tree had never been a stranger. She had always been the person waiting where I had unconsciously promised to return. Tears quietly filled my eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. "I thought something supernatural had been happening all these years," I whispered. Claire smiled gently. "Your mother believed the human heart sometimes protects what the mind cannot carry. She never thought the dreams were mysterious. She believed they were memories patiently knocking until you were finally ready to answer." We sat together in peaceful silence, while the realization settled inside me. For years I had searched for explanations outside myself, when the truth had quietly lived within me all along. The dreams had not been trying to tell me about someone I would someday meet. They had been guiding me back to someone I had loved deeply enough that even forgotten memories refused to let her disappear completely. As midnight approached, Claire quietly stood and walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she paused beneath the porch light and smiled with the same calm certainty I had first seen beside the lake. "Tomorrow morning," she said softly, "there is one place we still have not visited together." I looked at her curiously. She glanced toward the dark outline of the old greenhouse behind my mother's house before adding only one more sentence. "That is where the last memory is waiting for you." Morning arrived beneath a sky washed with pale gold as I followed Claire along the narrow stone path leading behind my mother's house. Dew rested across the grass, birds greeted the new day from towering maple trees, and the old greenhouse slowly emerged from the morning mist exactly as it had appeared in scattered fragments of my returning memories. Its weathered glass reflected the sunrise while climbing ivy curled gently around the wooden frame. Claire unlocked the faded green door without speaking. The familiar scent of soil, rosemary, lavender, and cedar immediately surrounded us as we stepped inside. Warm sunlight filtered through the glass roof, illuminating hundreds of thriving plants arranged with remarkable care. Nothing looked abandoned. Every flower had been watered. Every vine had been trimmed. Every wooden shelf remained exactly where I remembered it from childhood. I turned slowly in disbelief. "You kept all of this alive?" Claire smiled quietly. "Every Saturday morning for 17 years. I looked around the greenhouse with growing emotion. My mother had always called this place the heart of our home. Somehow Claire had protected it long after everyone else believed those days were gone. She walked toward a weathered workbench standing beneath the eastern window and gently lifted a small wooden box that rested beneath a linen cloth. Your mother asked me to leave this untouched until today. I carefully opened the lid. Inside rested pressed flowers, dried willow leaves, small sketches of the lake, and dozens of folded notes written on tiny pieces of stationery. They were not letters. They were little messages, each only a few sentences long, exchanged between Claire and me throughout that final summer. I unfolded the first one. Meet me after breakfast. The ducks are already waiting for us. I smiled through gathering tears before opening another. Do not forget your sketchbook today, because the sunrise belongs on paper. Another memory returned immediately. I remembered laughing while trying to draw the willow tree as Claire teased me for making every branch look too straight. The image remained clear instead of disappearing. I reached for another note. Promise you will never stop dreaming, even after we grow up. My own handwriting answered beneath it. Promise you will remind me if I ever do. I pressed the paper gently against my fingertips as the final missing pieces slowly settled into place. Claire watched quietly from across the greenhouse, allowing the memories to arrive without interruption. I remember us writing these, I whispered. I remember every morning we spent here before walking to the lake. Claire nodded, her green eyes shining softly. You are remembering faster now. I looked toward the far corner of the greenhouse, where an old white rocking chair stood beside a small table. Without thinking, I walked directly toward it. Resting inside the drawer was a tiny brass compass with faded blue paint along its edges. The instant I touched it, the last hidden memory returned completely. I saw the final afternoon before my family left Maple Ridge. Claire stood inside this very greenhouse holding the compass, while my mother wrapped the notebook in pale blue ribbon. Claire quietly placed the compass into my hand and said, Whenever you feel lost, it will remind you how to find home. Before I could answer, my parents called me outside because the moving truck had arrived. I remembered turning back one last time. Claire smiled bravely, even though tears filled her eyes. I promised I would come back before the first sunrise of autumn. Then we hugged goodbye beneath the greenhouse doorway. The memory no longer ended in darkness. It ended in love, hope, and a promise that distance had delayed but never truly broken. I slowly looked at Claire, my heart no longer searching for missing answers because they had finally become complete. I did not dream about you because fate was trying to introduce us, I said quietly. I dreamed about you because somewhere inside me I never stopped trying to keep my promise to come home. The greenhouse felt different after my memories returned. It was no longer simply a place filled with flowers and forgotten keepsakes. It had become living proof that love could survive distance, silence, and even forgotten years without losing its quiet strength. Claire stood beside me while morning sunlight poured through the old glass roof, warming the wooden floor beneath our feet. Neither of us needed to explain what had changed. The answers had finally found their way home. I gently closed the small wooden box and slipped the brass compass into my pocket. It no longer represented something I had lost. It represented something I had finally found again. Claire smiled as we stepped outside into the fresh autumn air. The path leading toward the lake shimmered beneath scattered golden leaves, and for the first time since returning to Maple Ridge, I noticed how peaceful everything truly felt. We walked side by side without rushing. Every familiar landmark awakened another ordinary memory instead of confusion. I remembered racing Claire along this very path after school. I remembered stopping beneath the old maple tree every October because she insisted the brightest leaves always fell first. I remembered my mother waiting on the porch with warm apple cider whenever we returned home before sunset. Those memories arrived naturally now, woven together into one continuous story instead of scattered fragments. As we reached the lakeshore, the willow tree stood quietly over the water exactly as it always had. The place no longer seemed mysterious. It simply felt like home. Claire looked across the calm lake before speaking. I spent years wondering whether you would ever remember enough to come back. I smiled softly. Part of me never really left. She looked toward me with gentle surprise, and I realized the words were true. Every dream had been another step guiding me toward this morning. We sat together on the old wooden bench where our faded initials remained carved into the weathered boards. I rested my hand beside the letters and laughed quietly. My carving was still crooked. Claire laughed with me. You insisted it gave the bench personality. The sound of our laughter drifted gently across the water, blending with birdsong and the rustling willow branches. It felt familiar in a way that words could barely describe. After a long, peaceful silence, Claire reached into her coat pocket and unfolded one final letter. Your mother gave me this the week before she passed away, she said. She asked me not to open it unless you remembered everything first.
She handed it to me.
The envelope carried only one sentence in my mother's handwriting. Read this together. Claire moved a little closer while I carefully unfolded the letter. My mother's words felt as though she were sitting beside us once again. My dear girls, if you are reading this together, then life has finally returned something neither time nor distance could truly take away. Do not waste another day mourning the years that felt lost. They were never empty. One of you remembered. The other dreamed. Together you carried the same story until both hearts were ready to hold it again. Love does not become smaller because life interrupts it. Sometimes it simply waits where kindness leaves it. Build your future looking forward, not backward, because the best chapters are always the ones we choose to write next. I lowered the letter slowly, while tears quietly filled my eyes. Claire wiped away her own tears before smiling through them. We both looked toward the endless water reflecting the clear blue sky. The dreams had brought me back. The memories had returned. My mother's quiet plan had reached its final page. Yet neither of us felt as though anything had ended. Sitting beneath the willow tree together, we both understood that after 17 years of waiting, our real story was only beginning. The following morning arrived without dreams for the first time in longer than I could remember. I opened my eyes to soft autumn light filling my childhood bedroom and realized that the familiar feeling of searching for someone had quietly disappeared. Instead of leaving behind an empty silence, it left behind an unexpected sense of peace. I smiled as I looked through the window toward the distant lake, knowing that the woman I had spent years trying to reach was no longer waiting inside my sleep. She was living only a few streets away. After breakfast, I walked to the bookstore where Claire was arranging new arrivals beneath the front display window. A small brass bell chimed as I opened the door. She looked up and smiled with the same warmth that had greeted me beneath the willow tree only days earlier.
Good morning, she said.
How did you sleep? I laughed softly. I finally slept like someone who is already home. Claire's smile widened, as though those words carried a meaning she had hoped to hear for many years. The morning passed naturally while I helped her organize shelves, unpack deliveries, and recommend novels to familiar customers who still remembered me from childhood. Some recognized my mother's smile in my face. Others welcomed me back, as though no time had passed at all. Watching Claire move comfortably through the bookstore, greeting every visitor by name and remembering their favorite authors, allowed me to see the life she had quietly built while I was away. She had never stopped moving forward, yet she had never stopped leaving space for the possibility that one day I might return. During lunch, we carried 2 cups of coffee onto the bookstore porch overlooking the quiet town square. Children rode bicycles past the fountain while neighbors paused to exchange friendly conversations beneath colorful autumn trees. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. I realized that the extraordinary part of my journey had never been mysterious dreams or forgotten memories. It had been discovering how faithfully kindness could endure through the passing of years. I've been thinking about something, I said. Claire looked toward me with gentle curiosity. When I return to Boston, everything will still be there. My apartment, my projects, my career. But for the first time, I cannot imagine simply continuing as though nothing has changed. Claire remained quiet, giving me space to finish. I do not know exactly what comes next, I admitted, but I know I do not want fear or unfinished memories to make my decisions anymore. She nodded slowly. Your mother used to say that healing is not about returning to the life you had before. It is about building a better one because of everything you learned. We sat together for a long moment while those words settled comfortably between us. Later that afternoon, we returned to my mother's house to sort through the remaining boxes stored in the attic. Instead of sadness, each discovery now brought gentle smiles. We found childhood drawings, handmade holiday ornaments, pressed wildflowers collected during long summer walks, and an unfinished architectural sketch my mother had proudly saved from high school. Claire laughed as she uncovered an old recipe card covered with handwritten notes from the afternoon we unsuccessfully tried to bake blueberry pie without following the instructions. Every forgotten object became another reminder that life was not measured only by dramatic moments. It was built from countless ordinary days shared with people who quietly shaped our hearts. As evenings settled over Maple Ridge, we carried 2 rocking chairs onto the front porch and watched the sunset paint the sky with shades of amber and rose. Neither of us hurried to define what we had become or what the future might eventually hold. We had already learned that some of the most meaningful chapters of life could never be forced into existence. They simply unfolded when trust, patience, and honesty finally met at the same place. Sitting beside Claire beneath the fading light, I understood with complete certainty that whatever story we chose to write next would not be guided by forgotten dreams anymore. It would be written one real day at a time. 3 weeks passed with surprising ease, measured not by dramatic discoveries, but by quiet routines that slowly transformed into the happiest part of my life. I postponed my return to Boston after arranging to manage my architectural projects remotely for the remainder of the season. What had begun as a temporary decision gradually became something much more meaningful. Every morning, Claire and I opened the bookstore together before the town awakened. The familiar sound of the brass bell above the front door became part of our daily rhythm, followed by fresh coffee, handwritten recommendations for readers, and conversations with neighbors who treated every visitor like family. During the afternoons, we worked side by side restoring my mother's greenhouse, carefully repairing old wooden shelves, replacing cracked panes of glass, and planting the flowers she had loved most. Each completed task felt less like preserving the past and more like preparing a place where new memories could begin. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the attic, I found a folder containing architectural sketches I had drawn years before leaving Maple Ridge. Claire spread them across the dining room table with genuine excitement. "You always wanted to design places where people felt welcome," she said while studying the pencil drawings. I smiled, because I had forgotten those early dreams until that moment. "Maybe I still do." She looked toward the greenhouse visible through the kitchen window. "Then perhaps this town still needs exactly that." Her words remained with me for days. The greenhouse, the bookstore, and my mother's house all shared something beyond history. They had become places where people gathered, shared stories, and quietly found comfort. One evening we walked through town discussing possibilities until an idea slowly took shape between us. We would restore the unused community hall beside the lake and transform it into a creative space where local artists, readers, students, and families could meet, learn, and celebrate the stories that connected generations. My architectural experience could guide the renovation. Claire's knowledge of the community could fill the building with life. For the first time in many years, my professional goals and my personal happiness no longer seemed to compete with one another. They naturally belonged together. As autumn slowly deepened, volunteers from across Maple Ridge joined the project. Retired carpenters offered their skills. High school students painted walls and built bookshelves. Garden clubs filled the outdoor spaces with native flowers. Parents donated furniture, while children filled one corner with handwritten messages about their favorite books and happiest memories. Watching the building come alive reminded me of something my mother often said. "A home is never created by walls alone. It is created by the people who choose to care for one another inside it." On the evening before the grand opening, Claire and I stood quietly inside the finished hall while sunlight poured through newly restored windows overlooking the lake. Books lined one wall. Comfortable reading chairs surrounded the fireplace. My architectural drawings framed the entrance beside photographs celebrating Maple Ridge through the decades. Everything felt peaceful, welcoming, and unmistakably alive. Claire reached for my hand without saying anything. I gently intertwined my fingers with hers, grateful for how naturally that simple gesture now felt. We looked through the windows toward the willow tree standing faithfully along the shoreline, its branches moving softly in the evening breeze exactly as they had through every season of our lives. I realized then that my mother's final gift had never been the journals, the letters, or even the dreams themselves. Her greatest gift had been creating the time and space for two people to rediscover not only each other, but also the kind of future they had always quietly hoped to build together. 1 year later, the first sunrise of autumn arrived wrapped in gentle mist, just as it always had over the quiet lake in Maple Ridge. I stood beneath the familiar willow tree with a warm cup of coffee in my hands, watching the calm water reflect the colors of the waking sky. The air carried the scent of pine, cedar, and fresh earth, and for the first time in my life, I understood why this place had always appeared inside my dreams. It had never been asking me to solve a mystery. It had simply been asking me to come home. Behind me, the restored community hall slowly came to life as volunteers prepared for another day filled with families, artists, readers, and neighbors gathering to share stories. Children's laughter drifted across the lawn while fresh flowers surrounded the entrance exactly as my mother would have loved. The greenhouse flourished beside the old house, brighter than it had been in decades, and the bookstore continued welcoming everyone who stepped through its front door with the same kindness that had quietly shaped this town for generations. I heard familiar footsteps approaching along the lakeside path before I even turned around. Claire smiled as she joined me beneath the willow tree, carrying the weathered notebook that had traveled through every chapter of our story. She opened it to the very first page where two teenage girls had once written a promise they barely understood. If one of us ever forgets, the other will remember for both of us. We smiled together before turning to the final blank page. Without speaking, I accepted the pen she offered. My handwriting looked steadier now than it had 17 years earlier. I wrote one simple sentence. We both found our way home.
Claire
Gently added another beneath mine. And this time we stayed. We closed the notebook together. Not because the story had ended, but because it no longer needed to live only inside its pages. Everything we had once hoped for had quietly become part of ordinary life. We spent our mornings welcoming visitors to the bookstore, our afternoons improving community spaces, and our evenings sharing quiet conversations on the front porch while the sun disappeared behind the hills. The dreams that had once filled every night had faded completely, replaced by real mornings, real laughter, and real memories that no longer feared being forgotten. Sometimes visitors asked why the willow tree beside the lake seemed so special. Claire and I would simply smile without trying to explain. Some places reveal their meaning only to the people who patiently return to them. Before leaving the lakeshore, I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the small brass compass Claire had given me all those years ago. I no longer needed it to find my way home, but I carried it anyway as a quiet reminder that the most important journeys are not measured in miles. They are measured in courage, patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to believe that love can survive even the longest seasons of silence. Together we walked back toward town beneath the golden light of the new morning, side by side, neither leading nor following, simply choosing the same direction. Behind us the willow tree swayed gently beside the peaceful water, faithfully watching another sunrise begin. Ahead of us waited another ordinary day filled with work, kindness, shared dreams, and countless small moments that would someday become cherished memories. At last I understood the meaning of the words I had heard inside that final dream. It really had been time. Not time to wake up, but time to finally begin living the life that had been patiently waiting for us all along.